The Red Lantern. Moulay Mohammed el-Khabri. A long time ago, in Marrakesh, there lived a poor, lowly, sweet seller called Kaddour. He was not a very successful sweet seller, and with each passing day he lost money and became poorer. Finally, the time came when he could not even afford to buy the honey he needed to make his sweets. But he was too ashamed to take up begging. "I shall leave Marrakesh," he said to himself, "and cross the Atlas Mountains. Perhaps I shall have better luck in another place." Kaddour set out on his journey, carrying the only thing he owned in the world. It was a small lantern, of the kind that they make in Marrakesh, fashioned out of tin and red glass. For many days, Kaddour walked over the snowy passes of the Atlas Mountains, surviving on the hospitality of local Berber people. At last, he descended from the great mountain range and journeyed for several more days across a vast arid desert until he stumbled upon a lush green valley, where he spotted a great city with its minarets glinting from afar in the sunlight, which no fellow traveler had ever described. Kaddour approached the gates of the city with trepidation. There he came across some men who were talking in the market, and he broke into conversation with them. They were astonished to hear his strange dialect and to discover that he was a stranger, because no outsider had ever visited their city. They took the sweet seller to see the Pasha, who invited him in as a guest in his own house. It was the richest building Kaddour had ever seen. Piles of precious stones lay casually on the carpets off its chambers, and even the most humdrum object seemed to be made of gold. For 3 days, as required by the Quran, the Pasha showered Kaddour with great kindness and hospitality. But after 3 of the most amazing days of his life, the time came for the sweet seller to leave. He was very troubled. He could not leave such a kind host without making him a present, and the only thing he had to give in return was his little lantern made of tin and red glass. Still, he hoped the Pasha would see that this was all he owned and accept the gift in the spirit it was intended. So, before taking his leave, he plucked up all his courage and presented the Pasha with the little lantern. The Pasha took the object in his hands and looked confused. There was silence in the house. Kaddour was worried that he had caused offense, but then, to his great amazement, the Pasha examined the little lantern with a look of wonder and delight. He could not take his eyes off the object. Now, in this city there was no glass. No one had ever heard of glass there. The houses had slits for windows, and the people drank from metal cups. To see the light of a candle shining through red glass was a miraculous sight to the Pasha. But grateful as as for the lantern, the Pasha also felt uncomfortable. For you cannot receive such a valuable gift without giving something of great worth in return. He did not know how he could possibly give a present of equal value, because he had nothing in his treasury but a lot of common gold, a ton or 2 of the usual rubies, a room full of the most ordinary emeralds, and some chests of diamonds that no one would look at twice. So how could he give this stranger a fitting return for his present? The Pasha thought for a while before deciding the only thing to do was to give almost all that he had. So he gave Kaddour 12 camel loads of gold and jewels, and he trusted, worthless as the present was, that Kaddour would accept it in the spirit in which it was intended. So the Pasha arranged for the 12 camels to be loaded with the gifts, and Kaddour drove the creatures back safely over the mountains to Marrakesh. When he came home, Kaddour decided that his sweet-selling days were over, so with his new riches he bought himself a beautiful garden. On the outskirts of Marrakesh, where he planted an orchard of almond, orange, and lemon trees. The garden was scented with jasmine and ek, OED to the sound of coal, running water, and the sweet voices of nightingales. In the middle of this garden, Kaddour built a magnificent mansion, where he lived as a rich and very contented man. He was the envy of all the young unmarried women in Marrakesh, and he chose the prettiest and most charming girl he could find. Now, Kador had a brother called Sed, who was also a shopkeeper and who had grown prosperous, while Kador had become poor. But instead of helping Kador in his time of crisis, Sed did not even acknowledge him as his brother. However, now that Kador was wealthy, Sed suddenly remembered the brotherly relationship. Sed went to visit Kador, who welcomed his sibling into his new home with generosity. Despite complimenting his brother on the new abode and dropping many hints, Sed could not discover the source of these new riches. Eventually, he lost patience and asked him Stravtot how he had amassed this wealth. Now, Kador was a simple spole who trusted everyone and never suffered from jealousy, so he told Sed the whole story, from beginning to end. Why things had turned out the way they did was still a mystery to Kador. He could not understand why the Pasha had given him such precious gifts. It had not occurred to him that the Pasha considered the lantern to be of such value. But since the Pasha had presented him with these gifts, he accepted what Allah had decreed and did not worry very much about it. But when Sed heard this story, he was even more astonished than his brother had been and began to obsess about it all day and night. What happened to Kador will surely happen to me, Sed thought. If they gave my brother all that wealth for a silly little red LSO, Sed amassed all the merchandise he could think of. He sold his house, and with the money from the sale, he bought even more merchandise. He bought several mules and loaded them with the goods. The poor beasts strained and buckled under the weight. Sed then set off over the mountains by the route that his brother had carefully described. Now, vicious bandits live in those mountains, but as it happened, when Kador walked through them, he had been protected by his POV, Urdi, because there is no better shield against robbery than that. Coming back with his camels laden with treasure, he had been protected by will of Allah, but scarcely had Sed traveled for more than a few days when robbers set upon him. They seized his mules and their precious cargo, beat him brutally and left him for dead under an argan tree. When he regained consciousness, Sed found himself as poor as his brother Kador had once been. But his shame prevented him from turning back into the treacherous bandit-ridden mountain passes, so he hurried on as fast as he could, until at last he came to the same lush valley as his brother had done before him. When Sed arrived in the city, he was taken to the Pasha's house and treated as hospitably as his brother had been. Beautiful female servants anointed his wounds with soothing medicinal oils. Musicians played soft tunes that eased his troubled mind. He was seated on embroidered cushions, fed the finest food, and looked after with enormous kindness. But when, after 3 days, the time came for Sed to leave, he bitterly regretted the loss of all the magnificent gifts which he had intended to give the Pasha. Of all his possessions, the only thing he had left was his watch, which was old, damaged, and made of brass. But his brother had only given a little red lantern, so Sed thought he would try his luck. He took a deep breath and presented the watch to the Pasha. Now, Sed was very lucky because watches, like glass, had never been heard of in that city. The Pasha stared at the watch with a sense of wonder, as if he was gazing at the stars for the first time, for he valued this watch far more than all those loads of merchandise which the robbers had seized. In fact, he prized it so much that he had to rack his brains to think of an adequate present to give in return, a treasure which would not leave him in shame or debt to the stranger. He had, of course, plenty of gold and jewels, but what were they worth, compared with such a gift? The only treasure he had left that was fit to exchange for the watch was the great gift that the previous stranger had given him, the red lantern. So, with deep regret, the Pasha ordered Kador's red glass lantern to be brought out from a cabinet on a velvet cushion, where it had rested in the strongest vault in the whole treasury, and presented it to Sed. So, with that lantern, Sed set out again for Marrakesh. And on this return journey the robbers saw no reason to trouble him.